Hello, I'm Brad Kelly, and you're listening to Method and Madness. This is a show about books, the people who write them, and the labyrinth to be explored between the words.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had his band. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had.
Shadow Ticket is the new book by Thomas Pynchon, thought by many to be the last novel to be published in his lifetime. The 88-year-old Thomas Pynchon has given us a typically kaleidoscopic and oft-times zany piece of revisionist history, this time starting in 1932 Milwaukee with one-time strikebreaker and now PI barely getting by Hicks McTaggart. We follow him off the increasingly bomb-happy streets of Milwaukee to Europe, where he is ostensibly pulling a retrieval job to bring back Daphne Airmont, heir to the cheese empire of one Bruno Airmont, the Al Capone of cheese, and a secret war with worldwide cheese syndicates and European government agencies, while simultaneously the man behind any number of nefarious plots. As in other works of Pynchon, we have a whole cast of outrageous characters, from Stuffy Keegan, a rum runner who escapes the threat of death on a mysterious Austro-Hungarian submarine in Lake Michigan, to Egon Prediger, a cokehead operative for the purported International Criminal Police Commission, and Zoltan von Kiss, a man who seems to have mastered the troubling phenomenon of apportation. So that's effectively something like the back of the book jacket copy, and we'll be getting much more into this, along with my guest, David Leo Rice, the co-host of the Wake Island podcast and author of multiple books, including the Room in Dodge City series, Angel House, The Berlin Wall, and most recently the Squimbop Condition, out now on 1111 Press. David will be joining me very soon for a Melee episode talking about this latter book, which I just finished up and can definitely recommend to people. So make sure you're subscribed wherever you listen to that so you don't miss that conversation, and buy David's book, please. It's good. You will like it. You will enjoy it. You'll be proud to have it on your shelf, and you'll be supporting a great contemporary writer. And remember, premium subscribers on Patreon and Substack do get early access to all this stuff. So if you're listening to this now and you're not a paid subscriber, you could have already listened to it, I guess. So sign up at madmethodpod.com/subscribe. Those premium subscribers will also get access to the forthcoming Madness presentation on Shadow Ticket, where I'll be going deep into the history of cocaine, the Pynchonian milieu that may have very well proved telepathy the very year in which Shadow Ticket takes place, the curious commonality between a bunch of the real-world characters Pynchon mentions, and much more. You do not want to miss it. Social chit-chat around here, as he learns from falling into conversation with a number of eccentric Airmont cousins wandering around without much to do, seems very focused on cheese. In particular, the recent Bruno Airmont Dairy Metaphysics Symposium, held annually at the Department of Cheese Studies at the UW branch in Sheboygan, this year featuring the deep and perennial question, does cheese, considered as a living entity, also possess consciousness? Cheese, oh, to be sure, cheese is alive, self-aware actually. Maybe not exactly the way we are, but still more than some clever simulation. We're at a pivot point here in the history of food science, a strange new form of life that was deliberately invented, like Dr. Frankenstein or something. Cheese, wait, cheese has feelings, you say? You mean like emotions? Long-time spiritual truth in Wisconsin, thousands of secretly devout cheesetarians. Secretly? Only waiting for our moment. We have to be careful, don't we? We wouldn't want to go through all that Christians and Romans business again, would we? Wisconsin is possessed by some vast earth-scented spirit of bovinity, docile herds of cows by the untold thousands all across the state, every day at the same hour lining up shed-side in patient queues waiting to be milked, while microbial cultures, silent yet conscious, working below the level of human attention, go on bringing a strange, shadowy inertia into human character. So, David, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate your time. And, we were talking a little bit before we started, based on the notes you sent me, I'm so glad that I asked you to come along for this. I think this is going to be a great conversation.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited too.
Yeah. I want to kind of start, let's call it sort of outside the book, some of the context around it, and then kind of work our way in. I think that'll make sense. And we'll just go wherever we please. But we both got some thoughts on this. I guess I wanted to start with what's been your experience with Thomas Pynchon up till now? Kind of where did you start and all that?
He was one of those people who I heard an interview with David Byrne once, and he was talking about, listening to AM radio, or something that he heard when he was a kid, and he said it sounded like they were sending the signal, that he picked up the signal that sent him where he needed to go. And Pynchon was definitely one of those artists that, sent the signal to me. So I think I first discovered him, I had this, as many writers do, this like heroic English teacher in high school who, was one of those, someone who opened a door that I didn't even know was there, which is a very Pynchon situation. And I was in her classroom when 9/11 happened, and she was the one who told us. And I can remember that super vividly. And she did tell us, and I think the teachers were told not to tell us. So she had this kind of intimacy with the students that was made us feel more adult and made us want to sort of rise to the occasion. And that same year, so, fall of 2001, she took my friend and me aside, and she said, you guys aren't going to enjoy the curriculum. This curriculum is, boilerplate, and I have to teach it, but you guys aren't going to enjoy it. And there's this new book called Infinite Jest that I think you guys are going to like a lot more.
Wow.
And this was just public high school in Northampton, Massachusetts, and of course she was fired the next year for, not following the curriculum. but she was an amazing teacher. And she took us aside, and literally that entire semester, which, is super burned in my mind because it was the beginning of high school and it was the immediate aftermath of 9/11. She just had my friend and me read Infinite Jest, and we would meet with her after class, once a week, and she would give us papers about it. And I don't know if we understood it all, but we felt so elected or elevated, that she saw something in us. And she was the first teacher who encouraged me to submit a story to a contest. And, she really kind of just opened a lot of these doors. And I remember on the back of Infinite Jest, there's this blurb that says, "Think Pynchon, think Gaddis, think." And I remember just looking at that and looking at those words, Pynchon and Gaddis. And I didn't even really know they were authors. I was sort of is this a subject? What does it mean to think Pynchon? That phrase was kind of intriguing to me. But somehow I, learned that they were authors, and I tracked them down on my parents' bookshelf. They had that orange, I don't know if it's a first edition, but very early edition of Gravity's Rainbow, and this old blue Penguin paperback of the Recognitions. And I remember taking both of those up to my room in 9th grade and trying them both. And Recognitions I got, bounced out almost immediately. But Gravity's Rainbow I made some progress on. I probably got, a couple hundred pages. And I remember at the time I worked for the cable access channel in Northampton. I was interested in filmmaking, so they would send me to film the city council meetings or the school committee meetings. And they sent me once to film a beauty pageant in Holyoke, Mass, which is this totally deserted, dead factory town. I think it was all old paper mills. And I remember taking that orange Gravity's Rainbow down to Holyoke with all this camera equipment and filming this pageant and sitting in this it was the middle of January in this drafty, middle school or high school gym, with all these parents cheering on these kids in the pageant, and just trying to read a few pages of Gravity's Rainbow in between whatever I had to do with the cameras and all of that. And then sitting in the parking lot after, with be dark at 4 p.m. and, I had the heater running, and I was just sitting there trying to read this book. And I don't know how deep into it I got or how much I got out of it at that time, but it was just enough to give me the sense that this was a world. This was something way beyond whatever else was out there, or this was if this was possible, then anything was possible, something like that. Or if this could be a book, then there's no limit on what a book could be, And I think an issue a lot of people have with Pynchon is this sense of not knowing how seriously to take it, or maybe better put, not knowing how to take it seriously. And I think I had that issue with Gravity's Rainbow too. You have the scene with the harmonica falling into the toilets, and I'm sort of is this supposed to be a joke, or am I missing the ways in which this is serious? And when you have so much reverence for it, or when it's so built up by reputation, it's hard to just be oh, this is just a joke. But I think if you can take it as that, you actually then start to see how it's serious. It's the same idea with Kafka, and maybe with a lot of great literature. you have to start on the level of humor, or like the things that are funny and absurd and ridiculous about it are meant to be. Quixote, even some of Dostoevsky, a lot of great literature has this kind of grotesque, like slapstick kind of depraved feeling about it. And then the deeper themes you enter only if you're able to see that grotesqueness as what it is. So anyway, I made some effort with Gravity's Rainbow. And then I really got all the way in after high school when I took a gap year between high school and college. And I spent the first half in Australia. And I have a lot of memories of bringing V, which I don't think was on my parents' shelf, but I bought somewhere, bringing V with me to Sydney. And I was obsessed in Sydney with like saving as much money as possible, or spending like next to nothing. So I would go like days at a time where I would just buy these huge bags of peanuts and like a gallon of milk. And I remember wandering around Sydney kind of like a lunatic and sitting in these beautiful public parks, that have these gigantic trees and like this kind of intense, like heavy, unfamiliar air, and just sitting there like eating these peanuts and drinking milk and reading V. And the feeling of, so many Pynchon's books, including Shadow Ticket, involve Americans abroad, right? They're always about Americans, going into some kind of other world and maybe reflecting on America from a remove or just discovering something else. But a lot of my fondest memories of Pynchon are reading it somewhere else, which is probably self-selecting in the sense that I tend to bring Pynchon books with me when I go on a trip.
Sure. Yeah.
But I remember being in Sydney and, I was 19 and, in this situation reading V, and I saw somewhere that he'd published it when he was 26. And I remember looking at that and just being like, what took him so long?
Right.
That seemed like a lifetime away.
Right. It was a late bloomer, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
But that was V. And then I finally really read, like I actually got all the way through Gravity's Rainbow when I lived in Germany after college. I spent a year in Berlin, which is where I wrote my book, Angel House. But being in Germany at that time was totally the right time to read Gravity's Rainbow. And like at that point, I was like, okay, I'm definitely going to get all the way through it. And I read the wikis and I sort of followed various, plot summaries or plot interpretation things as I was going. And that I got enough fuel to get to the end. And somehow that was totally infused in my own attempt to work on, what would become my first book during that year. And like being in Germany felt like I had to be there in order to truly lock in with Gravity's Rainbow, which is so much about just the strangeness of the German landscape and, all the things that are in the air in Germany.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. That's all a great story. As you were talking about that, I kind of thought there is something, there's something, I don't know if the word would be Pynchonian or Pynchonesque, but about Germany, certainly, but also on a certain level, from an American perspective, and I love my Australian friends, but there's something kind of funny from the American perspective about Australia, because we have this very strange perspective on it, basically through Crocodile. The typical American knows Australia through Crocodile Dundee and that one episode of The Simpsons, and we just know that they have like kind of weird animals down there, right? Like there is something. If Australia didn't exist, I could see Pynchon coming up with Australia, I guess is what I'm saying. It's, a prison colony, all of that. Yeah.
And it's a place that doesn't exist except if you go there. Like it's a place you would never pass through or pass over. Like there's no road that leads there except a direct trip there.
Right,
And also another Pynchonesque idea is it's like Bizarro America. It's like another British colony. It's another just vast frontier. There's a whole tradition of Australian Westerns. Mm-hmm. It's another, New World culture that's like uneasily integrated with, the natives who were there, to put it very mildly.
Right.
It has these huge coastal cities and then this completely unmapped interior. Mm-hmm. And there's this weird way that it's like America, but in a previous century or something, or like an America that never... Again, I love my Australian friends too, but like in America that never became fully civilized, that's like most of it is unknown
Yeah,
It's just, it's like the population of New York in a land the size of America. It's like, that's the situation.
It's pretty wild. Yeah, one of these days I'm going to have to get there. But as you say, it's not on the way to anywhere. So it's definitely like, this is where we're going. And it's also, that's about as far, I think that's the longest flight, I believe, from where I'm at. That would be pretty much the furthest away anything is, just about, is Australia. So
that's why I went there during the gap year, because I was like, I might never get here otherwise. It's like the kind of place you don't find yourself in for any particular reason, unless you specifically choose to go there. So I'm glad I did. And it also does have this Pynchon-esque feeling of, like, I don't know if I'll ever be back. Like, it feels almost like a vision or like some other life that I can't, I could just go back there, obviously, but like the way I think about it does feel very cordoned off from like conventional geography. It feels like it's not really on the, it's on the map, but like it's not on any routes you would take in the world, right? It's like a total zone of exception, which is a very Pynchon situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're gonna get more into that, because you had some interesting thoughts about that. The next thing I want to get to is so in 2003, Harold Bloom, I think he was in an interview and responding to like the popularity of like J.K. Rowling and Stephen King and all of that, had basically identified 4 writers as the greatest living American writers. I'm not sure if that's exactly the adjective he used, but that's the takeaway I got from it. And it was Thomas Pynchon, and it was Philip Roth, and Don DeLillo, and Cormac McCarthy. And since that time, Cormac McCarthy has passed on. Philip Roth has passed on. Thomas Pynchon's 88. Everybody assumes this is his last book. Don DeLillo is, I think, I'm pretty sure is even older than Thomas Pynchon. I imagine, maybe we'll see another book during his lifetime. Maybe we'll get a couple posthumous volumes. We'll probably get a couple posthumous volumes from Pynchon. Or maybe not, but all this is to say is, as this is sort of happening, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, there'll be no more Thomas Pynchon, Don DeLillo walking the streets. Is this the end of an era? I guess, first of all, what do you think of Harold Bloom's 4, identifying those 4? Did that make sense in 2003? Was he, obviously if you make a list of 4, you're leaving out a ton of people, but was that a particularly, blinkered idea of who were the greatest living writers in your opinion?
Yeah, at least they all got the Nobel Prize, right?
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I mean, it's one of those chicken and egg things. Like, had 4 other writers been presented to me in my formative years as the 4 greatest, I might have had a different feeling. But given that it has been these 4, it's hard not to feel that way. And it has drawn me toward them. Like, I've read more of those 4 than most other writers. I've read almost all the books of all of those writers. I guess it's an end of an era. Yeah, or it feels like the end of the time, in publishing, when someone could become that canonical, writing, truly adult books. And also, so much talk about this idea of systems novels and this, this trend within postmodernism. But I feel like all 4 of those writers have this sense of complete authority, right? Like, you trust both that they know everything that they need to know about writing and storytelling, but also that they like actually know how the world works. And maybe that's partially an illusion, but it's a successful illusion, especially with DeLillo and Pynchon, that they like really get how politics and warfare and economics and technology, that they really have a grasp on it. Like, they actually get it. And I worked for this British filmmaker for years during college and after. And he had worked in advertising in London in the 80s. And he said he would like get sent back and forth to New York on the Concorde regularly. He'd like go to New York for a signature and come back the same day, like a couple times a week. And he said in the 80s, no one was better at capturing what it felt like to be in that world at that time than DeLillo. DeLillo was always his favorite author, particularly because he said DeLillo just got what was going on in those years and like how the sort of world of finance was taking over, and you know what sort of globalization actually meant in a really like profound sense. So yeah, those do feel like maybe the end of the era in which even geniuses could understand the totality of something, you know. And I think like we're entering an era now where like it's not worth even trying, and maybe the point is not to try. Like we're entering an era now of like neo fragmentation, right? Or like there won't be any novels that try to put all the pieces together, and maybe there shouldn't be. Like it's just beyond us, or things are just run by inhuman intelligences at this point. Right. You know what I mean? So maybe those are the end of like we talk about them as being, you know, maximalist authors, and maybe they are like the maximum of human intelligence, and now whatever human intelligence is for is something much more interstitial, or like in the world of shadows, you know, speaking of Shadow Ticket. But I do sort of mourn the passing of those guys, but I also welcome whatever the next era is, because for better or worse, like that's the era I have to chew on. You know what I mean? Like it's, I don't see myself as working in the same milieu as them.
Yeah, that's I think the big thing. I think because I think there's a way of interpreting that sort of question: is this the end of an era? A sort of cynical take in which it's like, yeah, that means there's no good writers anymore, you know. And that's I think I'm fully on board with you here. It's the world was at least seemingly put together in a way that was, if not comprehensible, at least comprehensible enough for a genius to get their hands around. Whereas now, I think operating, I think it would almost be like a naive project to try to do it. I mean, what are you going to, you know, it's difficult enough to, and you know, I think this is sort of tangential to the conversation that I feel like I hear more of now than ever, but this sort of loss of the idea that we've lost the monoculture, which, you know, in America, we never really had exactly a monoculture, but we did have a much the proportion of the culture that was a shared reference for people was a lot bigger, and I do think that these guys kind of represented not part of the monoculture, and I say that because I could name a bunch of people that are sort of older than me who wouldn't recognize these names, right? Depending on sort of your class and educational status and interests and all of that. But, you know, in that monoculture, there was sort of, in that quote unquote monoculture, there were sort of neighborhoods. And this was sort of a big neighborhood, was the like really brilliant dude writing these, you know, huge American novels, in which, you know, maybe not Cormac McCarthy so much on the sort of the systems end. And my big blind spot amongst these four is Philip Roth. I guess I've read Human Stain and Conspiracy Against, is it Against the United States or Against America?
The Plot Against America. Yeah.
Plot Against America, yeah, which are both great books. That one was tricky because you're reading and it's got a swastika on the cover and you kind of got to like look around and make sure, you know. Yeah. This notion that like they were able to sort of at times kind of capture a picture of something that is moving much, much faster now. I think that's like the way that I think of it. It's like, you know, you can't paint still lifes anymore, metaphorically speaking, because everything is way too dynamic for that. At least that's the sort of lived experience. And then there's also something too where, like, as these guys are all, you know, to a certain demographic, these guys were all sort of iconic. There is, I think, shifts sort of perhaps in the publishing industry or whatever, that people like them as creators of, you know, commercial artifacts can't quite exist in the same way. I feel like I guess maybe we still have Jonathan Franzen, but you don't really hear much about him anymore. Just these guys who, you know, they're creating works that are huge critical reception. Everybody kind of knows that they'll be talked about in an academic and intellectual sense for years and decades. But they also make a living, right? Like, you know what I mean? Thomas Pynchon, we know Thomas Pynchon has money in the bank, right? And you know, we know, you know, they got to a certain degree wealthy off of it. And it does kind of feel like, I don't know if that kind of figure can exist anymore. Can you be a reclusive novelist who nobody knows what they look like and be a millionaire still? I'm not sure if that's possible, really. Maybe
and a lot of
it
it has gone overseas. Like you have Knausgaard, or you have, you know, it's like there's certain ways of, from the American point of view, we've sort of offshored that archetype. I mean, not that Knausgaard he's sort of the opposite of reclusive, right? But that you can be, you know, in a very interesting way, but that you can be, you know, rich and famous. You can be like a rock star novelist. Does kind of still exist, or Ian McEwan maybe, right? But that, you know, but those guys are kind of grandfathered in.
Or Welbeck,
Welbeck, for sure. Yeah. You know, I met, when I first moved to New York, I met with an agent and I was talking to her about Angel House, you know, and she was asking for comps and stuff, and we were talking about Pynchon. And she kind of shook her head and she's like, not only is it very unlikely, you know, that you or anyone else are the next Thomas Pynchon, but even if Thomas Pynchon gave me the manuscript of V right now, I wouldn't accept it.
Right. Yeah. And that's kind of how I feel about, like I said, that's how I feel about the masterpieces of all four of these guys, honestly. I kind of think Blood Meridian's probably similar in that way. Underworld is probably similar in that way. And it would be one of those things where it'd be, I really like this, but I don't know how to market it. Sorry. That's what I think the response would be typically if these just showed up on a literary agency's desk right now, which is, you know, sad to say, but also I think just is how it is.
That's why we have so many great small presses. I mean, it's kind of the you know, it's like a biological response to, you know, losing one. You know, you lose your right arm, so your left arm has to get stronger, or something like that. You know. No, and I really like that analogy. Actually, that's perfect. Yeah, because there's I think very little has changed in the sort of reservoir of talent. I think, you know, I've read stuff from doing podcasts from like people I know, including Squimbop Condition and some others, where I'm just like, yeah, this is incredible. Like, this is brilliant, you know, and it'll get its attention and people will like it. But it's not, I think forces have sort of shifted. There's really not the space in the bookstore that would have been that gets made for something like Shadow Ticket or whatever. On Shadow Ticket, you know, this is Pynchon's last book. What do you make of it as a last book? Like, if you see the whole trajectory, the whole Pynchon bookshelf, how do you see it fitting? Does it feel like a fitting end? Does it feel like he's retreading the same ground? Like, what do you make of it as a final book? And for him, I guess, as a writer's final book, maybe generally too, but specifically as Pynchon's final work. It's interesting that, you know, there's this idea that animals, you know, go home to die, or like, you want, you know, there's something like that. And the same thing with Philip Roth. You know, his last book, Nemesis, takes place in Newark during the polio epidemic in the early 40s, I guess. You know, but it's like the situation that he was growing up in. And Pynchon, you know, I don't think grew up in Milwaukee, but it's like the time period that he grew up in, right? The 30s, heading into the 40s. So maybe it's often the case that it's almost like a deathbed vision, or I don't know if Pynchon is dying, but like that, you know, towards the end of your life, you return to your origins and you have sort of one last tour through it. And maybe you say one final piece, or you come to understand something about the entire life that it then led to. Right, you return to like rereading a book, right? You return to the origin, and now you understand something about where it's going. And so Shadow Ticket definitely feels like that. And it feels, I don't know if it was deliberate all along on Pynchon's part, but it's kind of interesting that it fills in the one key time period of the past several hundred years that he hasn't touched yet. Right, I know there's his rumored Civil War novel, which maybe will appear one day, but it's like, you know, he has Mason and Dixon as kind of like the founding of America. Then there's Against the Day, which is, the turn of the century leading into World War One. Then you skip the Depression and the lead up to World War II until Shadow Ticket, right? And you have Gravity's Rainbow of, the war itself and the aftermath of the war. Then you have Lot 49 and V, which is like 60s, the era he was actually writing in at that time. Then Inherent Vice and Bleeding Edge are more recent history. But it seems interesting that it's like he put the final stone in his arch, or like the final piece on his, Yellow Brick Road, which is the actual moment that he came up in, or came out of, which is, how did we drift into the war, and like, what did it mean? What were the factors that happened such that both, America, I mean, the book's not about Pearl Harbor necessarily, but like, how did America end up in World War II? And what did it mean? And maybe, on a more ominous tone is like, who really won? Or like, what does it mean to say that we won? Right. And I feel like Shadow Ticket has this pretty damning sense of like, the die is cast. Like, we're just whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And we can come back to this idea later. Yeah. But I think it's really interesting that it's not, on some level, it's the least paranoid of his books, in the sense that, that Hicks, this investigator protagonist, is sort of investigating his case, but it's like he gets deep into this sort of web of conspiratorial kinds of things, but he's really not that interested in solving it. No. If you compare it to like Oedipa Maas from Lot 49, like that book is about her obsession and the sort of desire to put it together, which maybe is this kind of 60s optimism of like, if we could only pull back the curtain, or if we could only understand, what our government's really doing, or who really wields power, then something would change. Like, then we would free ourselves. And I don't think the book actually says that that's possible, but it has a character who at least believes it's possible. And Hicks, I don't think, like, isn't even thinking about it. He might not even be smart enough to believe that, he doesn't even know what he doesn't know.
Yeah,
and the book does feel like,
he's surpringly unparanoid. Hicks is surprisingly unparanoid for the things that happened to him in the book. there's a little bit of a like, okay, well, I guess this is what's happening now. Like, there's some confusion, and he has some questions about like, wait, who works for who? But in general, doesn't seem to be. There's almost this structure of that sort of classic like noir thing where you start to solve a crime and then you realize you're entangled in a conspiracy that goes right to the top. Like, there's the structure of that, but we don't get any of the. Hicks doesn't seem to have any of the feeling of that. It's sort of just kind of, he's sort of just bouncing through it a little bit, which I think is probably, I think is right in line with what you're saying. I mean, some of this, it's a little. There's, I think, positive and kind of negative ways to look at this sort of transition. I mean, on the one hand, it's like Thomas Pynchon's probably looked at this stuff as deeply as anybody. And his sort of, I guess his impression here is sort of like, it's either not worth looking at, it's not, I don't want to say it's not worth looking into. It's like, you can't go into it expecting you're actually going to find the answers. Like, there's not some single neck out there that you could, wring that neck and all the problems of the world to be solved. It doesn't work like that. Not that he ever suggested it was, but there's also like you kind of wonder, like, how do I want to phrase this? Does he, and it's not quite that he thinks it's a waste of time either. It's something like it's simply too complex and ultimately too dispersed to actually get to the root of. All you're really going to be able to do is sort of chart out the territory that's like immediately around you in a way. And I guess if you travel around, you can pick up some territories, but as soon as you cross from one border into another, there's a whole bespoke, individualized history to that place that has some entanglements with the history but is actually its whole own separate thing that may in some ways be the mirror image of the history you think you understand, which is one of kind of my favorite aspects of this book is how that works, how we go from place to place, and each place is through a different looking glass now into a separate place, which I think is really cool. I do want to get like even deeper into some of the specifics of the book, but I do want to make sure we hit one question, and I think it relates to this whole, sort of not only the end of an era thing, but specifically this coming to the end of Thomas Pynchon's contributions. Thomas Pynchon's sort of identified high up on that list of postmodern writers. Sort of, Gravity's Rainbow is a landmark in that case, and all of his books really are. You asked a question in the notes, what comes after postmodernism? So if Thomas Pynchon's gone, are we now in some new era? And this is a fascinating question that I think about quite a bit. What does come after postmodernism? What do you think?
That's sort of the question that I've been motivated by throughout all of my books, is what am I doing?
Right.
But it's sort of, it's like, what does it mean when the coolest, newest thing, postmodernism becomes the thing you grew up with? It's like, what does it mean almost when you are born too late, or when you live beyond what seems like the end of modernity? And I think, it's like, Umberto Eco has this great definition of postmodernism, and he's a kind of postmodernist, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And he says basically like postmodernism is not just the time period that we think of, 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe into the 90s, but it's a tendency that many cultures develop when the desire to feel certain things outlives the ability to express them sincerely. Right? When you have this feeling that like everything's been done and everything's been said, and yet people keep being born and they keep wanting to say and do those things, and yet you can't do it sincerely because it sounds like a cliche. Right? His example is like, a man wants to say, "I love you madly," to a woman, but he can't say it because it's a line from a romance novel. Right. So all he can say is, as a romance novel would say, "I love you madly." And then the woman understands that he really means it, but he also understands that she's jaded by having heard it a million times before. Right. And that's sort of the nature of postmodernism when it's done well, is that it's ironic and serious, and that it's, and Pynchon does this all the time, that it's like, take something like Against the Day, which is so based on like Hardy Boys and these kinds of, kids adventure, swashbuckling, ballooning, kind of like Tintin and stuff like that. And like, we still want to be swept away. We still want to feel that. But if you just do it straight, it feels cheap, right? Because it is. You're just referring to something that's already been done. So you have to get to this meta level where you're referring to the fact that you're referring to the fact that it's already been done. Yeah. But if you do it well, that starts to collapse and you actually enjoy it. And a lot of postmodernism is not enjoyable. A lot of it is cynical, but the things that are actually enjoyable have this element of like genuine sincerity. Like David Lynch is another good example of someone who really is a romantic and really believes in, human connection and transcendence and beauty and love and evil and, these kind of deep feelings, but is expressing it through a lens of infinite kitsch and commercialism and references upon references upon references. But at some point, even that collapses, right? So we're kind of at a point where even doing that doesn't really get you the juice anymore, because even that approach is too familiar. So I don't know. I think I was looking through, like my whole life I've kept notes on books I read or movies or just ideas I have. It's like this kind of master file I have. And I had one about this idea with Pynchon that, modernism is high culture mixed with low culture. Right, so take something like Ulysses, or anything from the 1920s, and it's like extremely rarefied, highly intellectual level of writing, but then it's combined with, fart jokes and guys just stumbling around drunk and peeing on the ground, or Faulkner, who we've talked about before, of like this huge sort of grandiose biblical, like Miltonian epic, but it's about, inbred hog farmers in a swamp, right? Right. So that's high culture mixed with low culture. And then postmodernism is high culture mixed with mass culture, which you can really only get after World War II, when you start to have TV and then video games, the internet, and,
right? You actually
have
mass culture. Yeah.
Totally, and so much of Pynchon is based on Looney Tunes and The Simpsons we've already talked about, or Shadow Ticket is full of like kind of gaudy movies and all this kind of stuff. But now I feel like we're in a moment where even mass culture doesn't really exist. Or it's become like a totally oversimplified form. If you think of like, who are people that everyone has heard of? It's like Donald Trump, Taylor Swift, like it's like four people maybe, right?
Yeah, there is.
Right. And then beyond that, we're all sort of re-fragmenting into these weird niches. And that, I think, is an interesting place to be. And like, I've heard this term necro-modernism used, which I don't exactly know what people mean by it. And I think it's one of those terms that's kind of molten and is not, hasn't coalesced yet. But I kind of like that term because maybe it means returning to a certain modernist tendency, or like a return to a very subjective point of view, not trying to do this God's eye, systems novel thing anymore. Right. But with this haunted, necrotic feeling that, modernism actually led, or maybe not directly, but was a kind of precursor to just like infinite horror. That it wasn't modern in the sense of moving toward greater sleekness and coolness and orderliness and, better living through technology. Like none of that happened, right? It led to just like endless war and paranoia and all the things that we are now dealing with. And I think it's interesting to almost think of the 2020s as this like ominous recursion of the 1920s. It's like the Australia to America, right? It's the shadow zone. Yeah. And so we're back in the world of the 20s. And actually most of my favorite authors come from the 1920s, right? Faulkner, Lovecraft, who we've talked about, Proust, Kafka, Bruno Schultz, Pessoa. It sort of is this high point of, I think, some of the greatest writing ever.
Sure, yeah.
And it's interesting to come back around to that now with the whole world of postmodernism behind us.
Right.
Or almost do to postmodernism what those people in the 20s were doing to like Victorian novels of the 1870s and 80s. And that's a strange thought of what that means, but I think that is what we're doing, whether we know it or not.
Yeah. It's funny, not to get like in, I don't want to talk at length about my own writing at all, but there is, I'm working on something set in 1934, and it's a sort of a noir-y kind of thing, and I'm doing my own thing with it. But I when I heard what Shadow Ticket was about, just the very basics when the first announcements were made, it was like a Milwaukee PI, 1932. I was like, why? Not that I'm on Pynchon's level by any means, but like, why am I thinking about writing like in this similar context? And he is, and like noir seems to be a big deal, like seems to be ever present or stronger than ever in terms of like the appeal of it to people. There is something there, right? There is something we're all like checking back roughly a century ago and sort of like locking in. Mass culture seems to be checking in about 30 years ago, 20 or 30 years ago. But there's there's something really interesting it's sort of a miniature version of this happening in the mass cultural scale, and I bet you've noticed this. There's this thing that's happened where we can't create, like you said, we have Donald Trump and we have Taylor Swift and half a dozen other people that my dad can name and my daughter can name, right? They both know.
That's a good test,
right? That they both know who this person is, and there's plenty of people that my daughter knows that I don't know at this point, right? And it turns out they're selling out concerts to tens of thousands of people, and I'm like, who? But there's a weird thing. There's a weird thing happening that's I've noticed this. We can't make movie stars anymore like we used to, like iconic that everybody knows. And so the thing that we've started to do is we just take those people, or the people who could be that person, and we put them in a role from Bob Dylan, Timothy Chalamet or whatever playing Bob Dylan, and then this recent thing with playing Bruce Springsteen, and then there's coming up to be a movie that's going to be like a biopic about the making of Rocky, which is just bizarre to me. But but we just take these people,
infinite meta levels, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and eventually that movie, at the end of that movie, the guy who plays Stallone starts producing the biopic about making, right? But there is like this thing where like we and I think it goes back to this thing you're talking about with Umberto Eco about trying to capture that feeling, but we can't do it the way that we used to do. And it seems like at the popular level, at least in some arenas, we're trying to take stuff now and shove it into the past and then sort of drag it forward and being like, well, we feel like we did in 1982 when Nebraska came out if we do this. And it's like, I don't think we actually will, but that seems to be the impulse, right? Like maybe we can't make a new Bruce Springsteen, apparently, but maybe we can take the guy from the cooking show that everybody likes and put him in a leather jacket and he'll sing the songs. And it's important that he actually sings the songs for some reason. And maybe we'll feel that same thing people felt. It's a very interesting process.
And it's like we can watch, this idea of you can use art as a fantasy like a lab of fantasy outcomes where you can stage a real problem, but then get the outcome you want. So it's like you can show someone struggling to write Nebraska, but unlike in the world today where apparently no one can do it, in the movie he just does it, but then the letdown is that you're like, oh yeah, but that's already been done. Like there is no catharsis because it's like that album already exists,
right?
But it's a lot of it's like, why do people do drugs or do dangerous things in order to feel like a kid again? Right? Like it's a sincere impulse, but it can lead to really dark places. Because part of being an adult means you're not a kid anymore, and there's this sort of sad thing where it's like, what do you do with that fact, right? It's like if your tendency is just to want to reclaim whatever those peak feelings of childhood were, are you already dooming your adult life, or is there a way as an adult to pursue that in a way that's healthy and good for you? I don't know. But, it's like, is the impulse itself unhealthy, or is it just that there are commercialized, unhealthy approaches to it, but there is some way you could pursue it in a healthy way? That I think is a really hard question.
I like to think you can pursue it a little bit in a healthy way. I want to think that, but maybe that's not actually. Maybe that just opens you up to being the sort of the target of like weaponized commercial content production, right? I'm distrustful of nostalgia, like in myself, like when it comes up. I mean, I love listening to like the music that was cool when I was a kid, but like beyond that, anytime somebody's sort of like trying to shove something in my face that feels like a deliberate attempt to claw at that, I'm always like super suspicious of it, I guess. And I think maybe that allows me a little bit of distance, but I'm certainly not immune to it, I guess. Yeah, it's interesting.
And maybe the Dylan thing is an interesting example in terms of mass culture also having moved on from postmodernism. Because if you think of I'm Not There or I'm Not Here, the earlier Dylan movie where 6 different people play Dylan from maybe 20 years ago, that's like a clearly postmodern work, right? Because it's about how do we tell the story of this great but mysterious figure who is hard to pin down, and it sort of uses its anxiety as its theme, right? It's not really a movie about Dylan, it's a movie about how do we make a movie about Dylan. Right. Whereas the new one, No Direction Home or whatever it's called.
I think that's it.
Something like that. Yeah, Timothy Chalamet, which I actually kind of enjoyed just as a piece of entertainment.
I'm sure it's fine. Like, I don't have any issue with enjoyable. These individually. It's just,
But it's not postmodern at all, right? It's very much like we're going to just ignore the elephant in the room of how do you talk about Dylan, and we're going to just present it as a straightforward hero story. A kid comes to New York with his guitar, and 2 hours later he's the biggest star in the world. Like that's the story, right? It's fine. It's cathartic. It's probably a pure confection. Like it doesn't have any insight about Dylan, but it's enjoyable to watch. But I think it is a symptom of this problem of like we don't really have a way within mass culture to diagnose the problem, right? Or to like get at why we feel this way. All we can do is ignore it and just say like, have some more candy, right? And it'll tide you over until you want even more, and you just keep
until the Springsteen biopic comes out, and then it'll be
Beatles ones are coming out. It's like they're going to just raid the archives of all these all these people.
Exactly. And then next well, they've already done anyway, they've already done a lot of them, and I think they've started putting more money into them a little bit, which isn't the same thing as making them good, but
I mean, I think related to Pynchon, I often think of Lynch, Dylan, and Pynchon as this kind of holy trinity of like boomer American artists, and that there's something kind of similar about them, in 3 different mediums, but they all have this like encyclopedic, autodidactic knowledge that they seem to know everything and have just like read and seen and listened to more than anyone else. And yet they also have this, I think this is like one of the best American traits, in that they're like permanent outsiders. Like no matter how famous they are, they're just like never became part of a school of thought. I mean, they were imitated obviously, but they never, they just retained their individuality and this sense of like, I'm going to just make up my own cosmos, or I'm going to have my own take on the world that's totally sui generis, even though it's informed by like an infinite stream of stuff, and it's a very non-academic approach, which I think is very appealing. That it's like there are people who clearly are super knowledgeable, but are not, they didn't absorb their knowledge through like prepackaged syllabi or context or schools of thought. They just stand outside of that. And I think that is a kind of, I don't know if it's uniquely American, but at least like distinctively American thing of like, we're not really part of, it's like we are part of world history and we're in some ways driving world history, but we're also like still newcomers to it or latecomers to it, right? And we're just not steeped in a school of thought the way, a Japanese novelist or an Italian novelist or a Russian novelist, however great they are still clearly part of a deep tradition.
Interesting.
Which gives them a certain strength, but I think American artists have a different kind of strength. They're just like, there is no precursor to David Lynch really, or to Bob Dylan. Like they're not, you can say Edward Hopper or Woody Guthrie or something, but that doesn't really explain it, right? It's like, you can see how they were inspired by those people, but there's something way beyond it that they're doing.
Yeah, well, and in Dylan's case, as soon as culture tried to box it in, he sort of intentionally blew it up, right? Like as soon as it was like, okay, now you are the folk singer, it was like, well, I'm just going to play an electric guitar and everybody's going to hate me for a few months. It's like,
totally,
yeah.
And they both also...
you can see that in Pynchon's reclusion is kind of that in a way. It's sort of like, well, I'll remain this sort of outside figure. The closest I'll come to appearing in mass culture is in the Simpsons cartoon with a bag over my head. It does prevent you, something about lacking that public image at all prevents you from putting him neatly in any particular, row on the spreadsheet.
Yeah, and I think something initially hopeful and now kind of sad about all 3 of them is I think they all started, as a lot of boomers did, with this like super can-do kind of transcendental attitude that like we're going to overcome whatever it is and we're going to find beauty in it. And a lot of the earlier Dylan, Lynch and Pynchon, all of whom deal with extreme darkness, but there was always this sense of light or this sense of somehow we're going to be okay. And I think in the later work of all 3 of them, that light gets darker and darker and darker. If you think of Twin Peaks: The Return or some of Dylan's later albums, or certainly Shadow Ticket, like they're pretty hopeless in a way. Like they're not really, there's not much of a silver lining. It's like we may have just like missed the boat, or gotten on the wrong boat. Like there's not a sense that we're going to be okay necessarily.
Yeah, no, that's very well put. And this actually transitions me into something else I want to talk about, because so obviously there's been a lot of reviews about this book, and I've read quite a few of them, and there's some really good stuff out there for sure. But one review, part of a review, on second look, a little bit unfairly in my opinion, got kind of memed in that it was flying all around, everybody was dunking on it. And this was the review by Catherine Scholes. I think, let me see if I have it. She says, I'll just read it quickly for people who haven't seen it. And this is only part of the review, and we'll talk a little bit about, or I'll talk a little bit about why I think this is sort of unfair to excerpt this, but, quote, even if you squint, it's difficult to determine whether Shadow Ticket is a commentary on our current era. This will disappoint any fans who are hoping for a rousing Pynchon riposte to our depressingly Pynchonesque era. If our reigning artist of paranoid convictions, of high crimes and deep states, of the peculiar combination of depravity and absurdity found in those who lust for power, if that guy hasn't made use of the present political moment to craft a satire or a survival manual or a swan song or even an I told you so, then what has he come here after a long silence and in all likelihood for the last time to tell us? Now, people are sort of making fun of that because because it was basically like, no, Catherine Schultz just wants Pynchon to tell her that her politics are correct. And I do think there's a little bit of it. I think there is a sort of a hint of that in this paragraph. It should be noted that, though, the sentences immediately preceding that excerpt, she basically says literature has no obligation to like make a political point or something like that. So she's being more fair than that excerpt just by itself, I think, might suggest. But I mean, we kind of talked about I guess we have been talking about this idea of sort of what has he come here to tell us? I mean, but what do you make of that expectation, I guess, that people might have that Pynchon is going to, I guess, put the final nail in the coffin of fascism or something? I'm not sure exactly what she wanted him to do, but what do you, I guess, make of that expectation?
Maybe it's related to that end of the era idea we were talking about, that, you know, we have this sense that these kind of sages, and especially someone like Pynchon, you know, who has not only written so much, but has apparently read some, you know, and has such a deep knowledge of history and of, you know, not just politics in terms of, you know, what someone's politics is, but politics in terms of what politics is, you know, like this sort of underlying sense of like, how do these kinds of movements develop and why do people group themselves the way that they do? And do people even know what they're actually supporting, you know, or what's using them for various ends? Maybe there is this hope that someone like that would have a master diagnosis, right? You know, or would have, even if not putting the final nail in any coffins, would have this sort of, here's what it's all adding up to, or like would just sort of clear the fog off of the glass and let us see what's, you know, the nature of this era is in a way that no one else can show us. And I think the fact that he can't do that is what he's saying in Shadow Ticket.
That's what I thought too.
Yeah, and maybe that's the meaning of the title. You know, the title within the book literally refers to the case that Hicks is given. You know, ticket, I guess, is like a hard-boiled term for a mystery, you know, something that an investigator is hired to explore. But I think on a deeper level, it both means, you know, a ticket into the world of the shadows, and maybe for Pynchon, it's like the afterlife or the end of this life. And for us, it means like whatever the next era is going to be, you know, our version, you know, and maybe it's not World War III necessarily, but it's like whatever the 1930s were leading to, it does feel like something is on the horizon that the 2020s are also leading to, whatever it's going to be. It feels like there's some, like the ways out of it or the ways around it are narrowing, and there's something that we're just barreling towards. And it's like, maybe it's an AI thing, maybe it's a war, maybe it's God knows what, a total recession, you know. Yeah. But it feels like that. And also when you were talking before about it feeling like a ride, you know, like a carnival ride, Shadow Ticket also is sort of like that it's like a ticket to just go on this roller coaster, and like it's not going to lead you anywhere. It's going to just take you where you started. It's going to come
back to where you started, right.
And that, you know,
and
and you're going to have thrills, but they're kind of fake, right? They're made up. You're not actually getting anywhere. And, you know, these various like boogeymen might pop out of the shadows, but you can't do anything about it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the ride is just going to go where it's going to go, and all you can do is buy a ticket for it.
Before Hicks knows it, they're out in the far northwest somewhere, a bleak stretch not yet assigned a district number, an all-night beat out of a sergeant's most ill-tempered threat, out in onshore winds not expected to get much above freezing, straw boxes few and far between, apt around any corner to find yourself up the wrong end of a Roscoe from somebody you knew in the 6th grade. There, look, nodding out the window. There it is, kid. Visible for miles across the bleak night prairie, the neon announcement, New Nuremberg Lanes. Not the traditional German typeface you see so much of around town, but modern sans serif, straight from the soon-to-be new and improved old country. 4 or 5 different colors from deep violet to blood orange. Bowling balls flickering left to right, pins scattering, reassembling again and again, silently except for an electrical drone fading up slowly louder the closer to it you get. The streetcar lets them off right in front. Inside, it's expensively designed as a movie set. Shoe check girls in matching outfits, working in pairs, one for the rubber sole side, one for leather. A different pair of girls available for southpaws. A custom ball laundering station. Lounge areas saturated in blue twilight, smelling like beer fumes, tobacco smoke, and hot griddle grease. A constant wood percussion from lanes near and far, echoes receding into the blur. All normal as club soda, yet somehow too normal. Yes, something is making a chill creep across Hicks's scalp, the sombrero of uneasiness as it's known in the racket. Something here is off. A bowling alley is supposed to be an oasis of beer and sociability, busy with cheerful keglers, popcorn by the bucketful, cross currents of flirtation, now and then somebody actually doing some bowling. But this crowd here, no, these customers are only pretending to bowl, stepping through spare conversion systems the way movie actors pretend to dance. Busy lighting each other's cigarettes, writing down phone numbers. Huh, who, me? Oh, just a carefree hour or two at the lanes, officer. Surely you don't think we're up to any monkey business. Wait, we're not going to roll a couple frames at least? Why am I carrying this ball? Where are we going? You'll see. On into a dimmer region of pool tables, pinball machines, and skee-ball setups, where it's currently semifinals week for the Northwest Milwaukee Skee-Ball League, defending champs of the ladies division, which dates from 1929, when the regulation lane was shortened to 14 feet to accommodate the ever-growing number of talented and serious gal devotees of the hardwood sphere, as they're known in the sports pages. It also doesn't hurt that the local league has chosen an alluring uniform, including 2-color box-pleat skirts, magenta and green, so that any motion beyond a simple shimmy produces a color spectacle not easy to ignore. Down some stairs, arriving presently at a jukebox going full blast, and a dance floor full of lindy-hopping youth. Hicks slowly recognizes an American swing-time version, at the moment getting some attention in Milwaukee, of the German street anthem known overseas as the Horst Wessel song. As meantime, a gent with a swastika armband moves in on Hicks for a swift finger once-over, finds the little snub nose, lifts it smoothly away. One thing I kind of got thinking in reading that response and thinking specifically about like how Pynchon is handling some aspects in Shadow Ticket that you could think of as sort of prescient or whatever. I got thinking about, like, if you somehow managed to not know anything about World War II, right? You had that part of your brain deleted. You'd never heard of it. You didn't know anything about it. And you were reading this book. There isn't a case against Nazis in here. It's all based on the fact that you kind of know where it's going, right? The scene when we go down into New Nuremberg Lanes, it's like, this is just a bunch of people drinking beer, and that guy's got a swastika armband on, but it's 1932. I'm not sure what, it doesn't, it's not, and I guess the prescient aspect of that is potentially, and I'm not sure if this is exactly what Pynchon's trying to do, but there's a reading I think you can make of it this way, where it's like, there is an element of like, that's the banality of things. When you're in the midst of it, you don't actually necessarily see how nefarious this thing is turning, right? It might just seem like, oh, people are kind of having fun or lashing out or being, sort of harmlessly reactive or whatever. But all that stuff. Yeah,
it's just like it's another kind of hooligan, the same as other kinds of hooligans.
Right. And it's like, yeah, I probably disagree with them, but it doesn't really matter or whatever. So maybe there is something in there, but in that what Pynchon might be trying to tell us. But to me, that doesn't feel like, to me, that almost feels too, that's almost too simplistic for Pynchon to me. Like, tons of people have been saying that for my whole adult life, right? So it's not, I think maybe he does sort of see things that way. I don't know, but I think that's a little too neat and tidy. I think I think what you're getting at is much more what's going on than just that. I want to get into some like kind of specific elements of the book. One thing I got really interested in is thinking about this triad of beer, cheese, and bowling. And as a Midwesterner, right? I grew up in Michigan, and I'm in Michigan right now, and Milwaukee's not that far away. It's right. It's right over there. And especially in the scope of this book, I'm practically neighbors with Milwaukee, and thinking about beer, cheese, and bowling as this sort of emblematic of a certain kind of Americana. I guess maybe the way to start this is like, is Pynchon, how to say this? Does Pynchon like beer, cheese, and bowling? I guess is the simplest way to ask that question. Or is he using this as like a way to sort of make fun of something or parody something or tell us about something else?
It's a good question, and maybe it's related to that Nazi question of, beer, cheese, and bowling is like blood and soil, or it's just like these sort of tangible things that are presented as the opposite of, global finance or rootless cosmopolitans or all these other types of things that were often, weaponized against Jews, right? In the sense of like these kind of tangible, homey, Heimische kinds of things that were just like anchored you to the ground, right? And that's
that is like the American. That is like the American folk is like beer, cheese, and bowling, right? Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. It's funny. I was thinking throughout this book, one aspect of it that I just can't relate to is cheese. Cheese is the one thing I don't eat. I've never eaten any cheese. I can't. Like, I'll send back anything that has cheese. So it's funny to think of it being so much about cheese, which is is also a slang for money, right? Dough or whatever, right? So there's some sense of it is connected to these, and he talks about that explicitly, right? Of cheese distribution networks, and it's
right.
I don't know,
syndicates and all that.
Cheese syndicates, exactly. The Al Capone of cheese, and maybe also the idea of being cheesy, right? There's something cheesy in terms of the plot itself feels like a kind of like rip off of any number of 1930s kinds of either screwball comedies or like Humphrey Bogart movies. It has that explicitly, right? It has that feeling. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's really interesting when you talked about like how do these nationalistic movements turn, and maybe it's the problem with history is that first of all it's written by the winners, we know that, but also like once you know the outcome of something, it then starts to look like fate, right? Or you understand it as that was always going to happen, which might be true in the sense of maybe there is only one timeline, but it doesn't mean that the people at the time knew that was going to happen, right? And I think that's interesting of like how could a love of beer, cheese, and bowling lead to something truly terrifying? And it seems like that doesn't make sense, but maybe that's always what happens, and I've been reading My Struggle, Volume 6, which has this long section about Hitler and sort of why Knausgaard used the name Mein Kampf. Yeah. And there's a lot of stuff in that, and the part that I'm reading right now, where he talks about like the early 30s and how a lot of even Jewish Germans either kind of thought Hitler was okay or didn't understand how serious it was going to be. And they're like, well, he's kind of a blowhard and he exaggerates a lot, but he doesn't really mean it. And we sort of we say these slogans, but we don't really mean them, and we just go along with it. And it on the one hand seems more benign than obviously the point it's going to reach, but there's something like really terrifying about trying to understand that's how things happen. You know what I mean? It's not that the people who supported Hitler in 1933 might not have supported the Hitler of 1943, but by that point it's way too late. way too late. But that's sort of the thing. Like that's the nature of human psychology, right? It's like people. Not only is it that no one thinks they're bad, it's like people often aren't bad. They just like step into a river that then is going where it's going, and there's a sense that you can't. By the time you would want to get out, you can't get out.
Yeah, and I guess it's tricky to know like what the takeaway from that is, because it's like, well, the response can't be that you just crush anything that seems the slightest bit hinky, right? Like, because you can't really live that way.
And that's its own fascism.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, precisely. Yeah. I mean, you could even, one thing I was kind of thinking about in this book was it's like, well, it's in Prohibition, which is clearly deliberate. And the New Nuremberg Lanes scene, I mean, how many people were at New Nuremberg Lanes because they wanted to drink beer? That's like the only reason they were really there. Right. And, you do sometimes think about like, okay, and not being allowed to drink beer, that is kind of an oppression. Maybe it's not the worst kind ever, but it is somebody telling you what to do and sort of enforcing what to me seems like an unfair set of rules on you. But then, you do kind of wonder, it's like, okay, well, you start off just going there to get a beer, and then you meet a guy, you meet Uli, and he seems okay, right? And then, he seems like an all right guy. Well, he's got this weird armband, but that's fine. He's a good dude. And then, a few years later, you find yourself in the same organization as him or whatever. These things happen by like slow incremental steps that stopping them at any one point seems pointless or something. Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe that's sort of something you see throughout Pynchon is this idea of, really trying to ask, like, what is history? Right, because it's like history is everywhere and nowhere, right? On the one hand, going to the bowling alley for a beer is just going to the bowling alley for a beer. Like, it's not history, and yet history is only a succession of things like that.
Yes.
And that's the hard thing to know. Like, what does it mean? We're always living through history, and yet we're always unaware of it. We're always, when you hear the word history, you think of looking back at some kind of completed story. Right, because in order to study it, you sort of have to be able to tell your students a story of like, this is where it was going, or this is why this happened, or whatever. But in the moment, that's never the case. And it's like a really hard, there's no good way to legislate that, right? Because on the one hand, if you say no one can bowl and have beer, you've already created a sort of totalitarian system. On the other hand, if you say, great, do what you want, then slowly these kind of Nazi networks grow, and then it's too late, right? So it's, it's like your own health, right? How do you, if you're terrified about everything you ever eat and drink, your life is going to be miserable. On the other hand, if you never think about it, your life might turn miserable for the opposite reason.
Yeah, no, that's brilliantly put. Yeah, I remember hearing some. This might have been like back when I used to listen to Ram Dass. He would talk about how there's a certain kind of person who quits smoking who spends the rest of their life being thinking about it, and it's like they die of quitting from smoking, basically, right? It's kind of like that, where it's just like a preoccupation and yeah. So the idea that we're going to stamp out any inkling of like politics we don't like or totalitarianism, it kind of ends up being its own. It kind of ends up being it's maybe even trite to say, it ends up being what it sought to destroy in a certain sense. Even though the aesthetics of it might be different or whatever. And
maybe that's why it becomes inevitable. It's like when, open society or kind of just normal, like neutral society, let's say, ceases to work for whatever reason. But when you have too many people who are too upset about the way things are going, it's like the die is cast either way. You can have a left, or a right fascism, but it almost doesn't matter because someone's going to take control and crush everyone else. Because that will already exists among the people. It can be Germany, it can be China, it doesn't matter, right? It's like you're fucked when that happens, right? It's like you have to prevent that from happening. And maybe it's inevitable. Maybe it's a phase you can't get around.
Oh, you just go through. I mean, it might be just go through these cycles where, like, you just hope that you live in this temporary trough where it's not, peaking in some way, right? Yeah.
And maybe that's Pynchon's life. He was very aware that he lived in the trough. He lived in this very lucky, as did everyone of that generation, this very lucky post-war era in which America had won basically two wars, right, or a two-front war. And became incredibly prosperous and powerful and sort of legislated what everyone on the globe was going to do. And then it's just like we slowly rotted from within, right? Or it's like there was something we didn't attend to in our own culture. Yeah. And we were too rich and powerful to think it was a problem and too numbed by entertainment. Right. And now it's like we're reaching a point where it's just like chickens are coming home to roost. And like the avatar of who brings us that news can be, anyone. But it's like the news is the news. Like you can't get around that fact. If that's the truth, it's gonna come out, and it feels like it is.
Yeah. Ooh, all right.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, right. Pynchon, and maybe that's what he's saying. He's like, look, guys, I'm getting out just in time.
Yeah,
like, I had
I'm checking out. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys are on your own now. Yeah.
Right,
Totally.
right. Well,
right. Maybe in that review, by Schultz that you quoted, her disappointment is accurate in the sense that Pynchon is telling us that he has nothing to tell us. It's just maybe we can't expect him to, or it's like, why would he have something to tell us? You know what I mean?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. I think there is a, there is a sense in which there are aspects of history kind of repeating themselves, but there's also with, AI and information technology and things, there is a pattern that is unprecedented to a certain extent. And I think in one way, I can understand wanting somebody like Thomas Pynchon or a sage from a previous generation to give you something like help us survive the 21st century. But on the other hand, it's like they don't actually know anybody. Like nobody knows what's about to happen. Like nobody. There's a singularity looming out there. Everybody across the political, as you kind of mentioned, everybody across the political spectrum can feel it. They think it looks different from their different angle, but it's coming, and nobody knows what's on the other side of that thing. That's kind of how I see it. So, I don't know.
Maybe that's an aspect of, what I'm trying out calling necromodernism, right? But it's like whatever the literature of this moment is, maybe the goal is that it somehow has to be focused on the what rather than the why, right? That it feels as though things are happening for reasons that are too complex or too algorithmic or too secret to truly understand. And therefore there's a huge desire for oversimplification, or people who can, have a shtick about this is happening because of that, get very popular. But I think like genuine art in this moment has to just focus on the phenomena. It has to just catalog, like, here's what's happening, and maybe try to come up with metaphors or with, symbolic situations that clarify it. It's like, here's what it feels like for this to be happening. But I really don't think you can diagnose the cause.
Right. Yeah, it's too well, and yeah, that's interesting. I mean, part of the reason you can't diagnose the cause anymore is we used to think we could historically diagnose the causes, but really what we were doing was abstracting something down into a really simple, straightforward narrative that cut out all kinds of people, and then saying that's why it happened. And it's like, yeah, no, that's not really, that doesn't square with the experience of like 80% of people, but okay, yeah. And now with the way that we're all sort of sharing our narratives together, we kind of realize that you can't box it in like that. There's just, everybody has Twitter. Everybody's a journalist now, which is presumably a good thing, but has its sort of knock-on consequences for sure. Yeah.
And it has to do with these, mass effects too. The same thing, like if you go to the bowling alley, and you meet one Nazi, he might be a nice guy. Like, it's not that guy's fault, right? But it's like something about, these huge collective phenomena that are made up of people, but are made up of some kind of consciousness beyond any one person. And therefore you can't point to anyone. Even the leader, you could say the leader is more, to blame, but they're still leading. They're only a leader because they have the support of the people, right? So like where that feeling comes from is like some kind of vast and complex force. Yeah, and I think that's the thing that, Pynchon got as close as anyone could to showing what those forces are, especially in something like Gravity's Rainbow and Against the Day. But then maybe Shadow Ticket is a bit of a, like, I give up, but or a bit of a, there's something like, not only is Shadow Ticket much shorter than his giant books, but it's like much... It's not even that it's simpler, but it's less sticky, right? It's like less intriguing to try to put the pieces together. It's more obvious that they don't fit together.
Right.
And I think it has that sense of like, you're going to just go through this and you're going to see what you see, and different people are going to tell you different things, and some of them might be lying, and some of them might not even be real people, but that's what it is. That's what's going to happen to you.
Yeah, you don't even get the sense like, oh, we're going to find out who's actually running the international cheese syndicate. Like, no, it's this like amorphous thing that sort of exists. It might be even like semi-autonomous, basically, right? Like, or we'll get there and we'll find out that it is just cheese running itself or something. Like, there won't be a singular explanation. This, I want to try to segue into something you pointed out in the notes that I was thinking about as well. This sort of Pynchonian, and he does this quite a bit, but I'm curious what your thoughts are about what he's doing with it. This basically charting out I'm putting historical in sort of scare quotes, islands, DMZs, as you called it, micro-utopias, temporary autonomous zones. There's a number of them in Shadow Ticket, and there's a number of them in all of Pynchon's work. Bruno had been hearing about Fiume since it was still an independent state under D'Annunzio. What brought him there in person was a scouting assignment on behalf of Inchison, which by then had grown more global and sinister in scope, avoiding central headquarters, instead choosing a more distributed model, free zone hopping, setting up shop in short-lived entities emerging from the World War and the Russian Revolution, preferring mixed populations, disputed territories, histories of plebiscites and provisional government, currencies printed on inexpensive stock and fugitive inks. Fiume, despite a rumor Woodrow Wilson was once considering it as a site for the League of Nations HQ, turned out to be one such focus of impermanence. Bruno himself, by then, keeping on the hop, expecting the door to be kicked in any minute, avoiding paperwork, file cabinets, anything too heavy to pick up and vamoose with, took little more than a look and was instantly charmed, inquiring a villa just across the border from the new Yugoslavian entity. In fact, having no agreed-upon location unless currently in dispute is your idea of a postal address, at times partially situated in Serbo-Croat Slovene territory and part in fascist Italy, from which, if necessary, a cheese magnate on the move could easily step from country to country as long as he's willing to put up with centuries, delays, routines of the borderline that require constant attention to grease and gratuities. For Daphne, the villa is a place where she would gladly have come home to, even to live in. Her prayers for Bruno having once almost included the hope that he'd grow into somebody who'd understand and deserve someplace very like this, however much South Sea cooch-dancing tabloid scenarios might turn out to be more up his alley. The villa dates from just after the war, when D'Annunzio's republic was young and Fiume had a reputation as a party town, fun-seekers converging from all over, whoopee of many persuasions, wide open to nudists, vegetarians, coke-snorters, tricksters, pirates, and runners of contraband, orgy-goers, fighters of the after-dark hand-grenade duels, astounders of the bourgeoisie, bridges, archways, views of the Gulf and the islands, floor plan like a native quarter, with a lengthy history of resurveys and legal shouting matches in various international courtrooms. Easy for visitors to get lost climbing up and down among levels, running mazes vertical and horizontal, navigating an indoor geography they fail to learn much about before it's time to move on. Nobody knows how many rooms there are, scale enough for suites and wings, alliances and betrayals, storms of armed emotions sweeping through the house unannounced. At night, the lights of the villa shine far out over the sea, all night long. Behind each window, someone is always awake late and up to something. Night owls, freeloaders, accidental walk-ins, practitioners of esoteric arts, fearers of the dark, compulsive socializers, secret police, jewel thieves, firefly girls, drug dealers, cigarette factory workers, tobacco smugglers, a dependable number each evening lately of trans-trianon bikers, though it hasn't taken local authorities long to outlaw group motor sorties after dark. Not that anybody complies or that there are enough personnel on hand to do anything about it. What does Pynchon think those are? What does he think those are? Like, I got thinking and reading about and thinking about this. I got thinking about the writing of this guy Hakim Bey, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with him at all. He's an anarchist writer, born Peter Lamborn Wilson. And he had a book called basically a long essay called Temporary Autonomous Zones. And not to get too into it, but like sort of the takeaway was like, you're never really going to be free in society. The best you can do is that occasionally you can get some territory and some people together and you guys can be free for a little bit. That's sort of like the takeaway from it. And then you'll have to go back to your normal lives, and then maybe you can piece together some other temporary autonomous zone for a while. I don't know that that's what Pynchon is saying necessarily, but what do you think they mean to him in this work?
It's probably something like that, that he I mean, there is probably some historical and geographical reality to it, to these, cities that are not quite absorbed into any state.
Mm-hmm.
Or
yeah, Fume was like
Fume
that.
Yeah. Or and Gravity's Rainbow is all about the idea of the zone, which is not utopian necessarily, but it's like a place that is run by its own laws. Right. And and I think that's also how Pynchon seems to understand the idea of magic, right, or of the supernatural. That it's like there's these moments where it can happen. Like if you ask, is Pynchon a magical realist? I would say not really, right? Because he doesn't have a world. It's not like Garcia Marquez where it's like this kind of magic exists everywhere, or Rushdie or Murakami. It's not quite like that. And yet he's obviously not a strict realist either, right? So there are these moments, which you see in Shadow Ticket also, where things can appear and disappear, or people like teleport, or, you have golems. And there are these like localized magic, or like stochastic magic. And maybe that's similar to how he views these kinds of utopias, which is like there's little points on the map where the rules don't apply. And sometimes they're just like a building, right? Like he's great at describing these kinds of nightclubs or cinemas or, some kind of a party that's like just off the map, which I guess exists in the real world too. If you think of, raves or these things in bunkers, or even, what Burning Man started out as, whatever it is now, but like these kinds of ideas that exist, I think is a very deep part of America, is to like create these little utopias. And maybe there's an idea that can be done peacefully. Whereas if you try to create a nation-sized utopia, then you're heading towards genocide. Like that's just inevitably going to end up killing everyone, right? Like, so there's a sense that, you have to, like you said, the best you can do is like try to keep it small and local. And maybe on a, meta level, that's what Pynchon's books themselves are, right? They're not a manual for how to live, or they're certainly not a policy proposal to put it mildly. But they are these little windows into like another way that it could be, and maybe to give it, as much credit as possible, like a window onto how things actually are, but that you can only see for a little while.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I used to, I remember having this feeling in high school when I was first trying psychedelics, that I would have these visions of totality, or feeling like I, was inside the room where the secrets are. And then I would always have this disappointment at like coming back and kind of forgetting what I had seen, or having this idea that I should have like retrieved some knowledge or come back with something that is durably actionable, like knowing what to do. But I think that's a kind of it's a necessary perspective, but it's a kind of immature perspective. In the more mature perspective is like all you can ever really know is that room is there. You can't take anything from it. It's like visiting a museum. I guess you can steal stuff from the museum, but you're not supposed to, right? It's like seeing things that are right. It's like if I want to see this painting, I have to go there, and that's all I can do. But if I love this painting and I know where it is, that does make my life better.
It allows you to like reprioritize what the point of it is. It's about going there, and it's about the temporary nature of it in some ways, right?
Totally.
It's not about making Shadow Ticket the world. It's about going into Shadow Ticket for a while and getting what having the experience of it. Yeah.
Because I think when I was younger, I was very terrified of temporariness, which I think is what made me into a writer, and maybe makes anyone into a writer, is like wanting to make something permanent, or wanting my thoughts not to just pass on, but to, not even in terms of death, but even in terms of just one day to the next. Not wanting things to be ephemeral, being like, I have to set this down and fix it on paper. And that's true, that if you want to write something, you do have to do that. But I think over time, I've evolved into a more, maybe it's just a kind of surrender, right? But a more resigned idea toward like everything's going to pass no matter what. And the idea of truth, this might be being a child of, the 80s and 90s and having absorbed this sort of world of postmodernism, but this feeling that truth is like an orientation or an attitude toward the world rather than a fact, right? Rather, there are facts, but facts somehow are not the truth. That might be true, right? But the idea of the truth is always something that's dynamic. It's always a certain thing that you're either in harmony with or in conflict with, but it's not like you can just spit it out.
Right.
Right, which does seem to be borne out by if you meet, older people who seem to have this sense of real wisdom. It's always a kind of sense of humor, really, right? Or a certain feeling about, the kind of beautiful absurdity of life. It's not like they can just tell you, here's what you should do. Like they can't, anyone telling you that you probably shouldn't listen to, right?
Right. Yeah, and they tend to hold things very lightly for the most part, right? It's all, you kind of all know it's passing show for sure. Yeah, I think I definitely think that Pynchon is kind of pointing to these things as, at least some of them, as like you get to I can't remember what city they're in the book because there's so much sort of bopping around Europe, but it's the nightclub where Daphne Airmont finally kind of runs into her father, Bruno Airmont. It's a club called the Night of the World, and apparently it's like multiple stories deep, and some people...
That was one of my favorite scenes, yeah.
That was great. It was great. And some of the bottom stories are just like rumored, like people aren't even sure that they're there. And there's this weird technology for the time, for sure, these face tubes where you can like look into your tabletop, and then across the room, somebody else is looking into their tabletop and looking at a low resolution image of you. Super cool stuff. And I think sort of on the positive end, I think Pynchon, and another one is a great one, is the whole Trans-Trianon motorcycle trip, which is like a mobile temporary autonomous zone, right? That's just constantly revolving, which might be one way to keep the thing. I mean, maybe in a way, a temporary autonomous zone is like a bicycle. Like it'll only stand up if it's in motion to some degree.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I love him. I think he is definitely pointing to them to like, I think he's reveling in them. You can tell just by the way he's writing about them. Because when he's getting into one of them, and there's, I don't know how many in this book, there's a few. I mean, the submarine itself is one. There's this element of, he goes into, when he's writing about them, he falls into the heterogeneous list for description, where it's just like, boom, here's like, you get like 75 details in a row about what this thing is. So you can tell he's reveling in the creation of it. And I think just by that fact, he's sort of pointing to like, this is indicating to us some kind of way we can manage something. And I think you're right. The permanence trying to make it permanent is how to make it super fragile, right? Because if you take, I mean, you think about, so you mentioned Burning Man. So I've been to Burning Man. It's great. It's an incredible time. You want to go home when it's the time to go home. You're ready to leave.
That could be a good thing too, if it makes you reappreciate your home, right?
right. You're tired and you stink, and but there is like this thing where the motive, something like that, and you see this too in you see this too in American music festival culture. Like, which we used to like not have those basically, or there were very few in front. There was sort of Woodstock, and there were a handful of others, and now every summer there's hundreds of these things, sort of camp out music festivals where people go, they're a long weekend or whatever, and these are kind of these temporary autonomous zones. Drug use is sort of everybody kind of pretends it's not happening, but nobody really cares, all this stuff. There is the motivation that brings those people into those things. It wouldn't take very many people who had more sinister motivations to come in there and to exploit them, because those people that are involved in it, they're not interested in power. Like, nobody's trying to run the music festival, right? So you're just there to
except probably huge companies that actually do run them.
Who do now. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, it got super commodified, right? So yeah, that did happen. So yeah, so like, try to do Burning Man year round, it would be run by a warlord within a couple of months, right? Like,
it'd be Mad Max.
Yeah, exactly. Now instead, you can just pretend it's Mad Max while you're like on ecstasy or whatever.
Yeah.
But there's, I think there is some wisdom in sort of accepting. So not only accepting physically the temporary autonomous zone, this has to be a temporary thing, but like maybe like, the objectives of sort of the American obsession with being happy, right? And like, we all have to like love our jobs and this and that. Like, maybe that seeking of permanence is in its own sense is sort of degrades actually having moments of that thing you're looking for, right?
Yeah,
which
and
you
maybe
might actually be able to get.
In terms of Pynchon's like larger project, that's sort of the beauty and tragedy of America, is that America viewed itself as this new utopian project overall, and was filled with utopian projects on a more micro level throughout its history. Do you know this book, The Stammering Century?
I've heard of that. I've never read it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, it's like a history of the 19th century in terms of anti-progress movements. It said like the dominant voice of the 19th century was, capital and railroad and go west and all that. But the way it frames it is like these stammering voices was these like, small communes all throughout the country that were either, socialist communes or diet communes or extreme religious communes or whatever they may be. But the idea that America was, even before the 20th century, was already fragmenting into these little micro zones.
Yeah.
And maybe Pynchon's dilemma or the thing he had to work out was like what became of the hippie movement. Like I feel like he was basically a hippie as far as I can tell. And I grew up in Western Mass with this kind of neo hippie feeling. It's like, when Fish was huge, it was this kind of thing when everyone was wearing tie-dye and like all of our parents were kind of like acid heads who would become, respectable professionals. And there was this sense that I think an ambivalence about whether that was good or not, right? Like the fact, and a lot of people have studied this, right? But how did the hippies become the yuppies? How did the people at Woodstock in, the 60s end up voting for Reagan in the 80s, right? But it happened. And that's what Vineland is about, really, Yeah. But I think it's an interesting question of like, is it settling to say that these kinds of zones of freedom have to exist within like a military capitalistic culture, right? So you can go to Bonnaroo for 2 days and you can drop acid and, you're suddenly best friends with the strangers who are next to you. And that's great. I love Bonnaroo.
That's great. Yeah.
But it's like, is that the best we can do, in the sense that if we tried to extend that longer, we would already be tiptoeing toward a disaster? Or have we been so like capital pilled that we think that's the best we can do and we've given up trying to do better?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think and I do think there is an aspect of Pynchon that's kind of circling that, right? But it's kind of complicated because those zones, they're also where like totalitarian ideologies can take root, right? So that's where Nazism can take root in one of these zones, and communism can take root in one of these zones as well. So it's like, it's not that they're these pure crystalline things. It's like,
or that they're too pure. That might be the problem, actually.
Right. Yeah, they don't have, because they're sort of, we're inside this space. There are no rules, and then somebody's like, okay, cool. So it's all right if we want to commit genocide against the group. Yeah, I guess we don't have any rules. We don't have any way to enforce them. So I guess that's okay. Yeah,
totally.
it's like,
and if your goal is like, we're going to have a perfect world for 1,000 years, if you get sure enough of that, then nothing would be too much to ask in order to get there.
Right.
There's no price that's too high to pay if you're convinced you're going to live in a perfect world for 1,000 years.
Right. Yeah. It's, you could take out most of your population if that fit the ultimate ends that you were going for.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh man.
It's scary, right? But then that sort of raises the question of like, is it? Does that mean you always have to settle for mediocrity? That's like the terrifying question.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it feels like as a country we have kind of, maybe not.
Yeah. Well, maybe until now, and now we're going to see what happens, right? But are we going to tip into some kind of genuine fanaticism? It does feel like we're tilting on the edge. Yeah. And it could come from any side, right? It's not that only one side feels that way. I think like every side is starting to feel like the method, speaking of method and madness, right? That the method is less and less important once the madness gets more and more dialed up. Like, it becomes the like by any means necessary thing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the deep question of like, is a kind of, open society or like a non-polarized society always a mediocre society? Is there any way to have a great society that is not, rigidly crushing dissent?
Right. And thereby crushing creativity, and a lot of the things that I'm personally interested in, right? And not even just creativity in the sort of like artsy sense, to let people do like what you do and what I do, but like also stuff I'm not quite as interested in, but is on some level important, is like technical innovation as well, right? Like there is some shared DNA there. It's like if you make things too, we can lament. People can lament the social implications of like Twitter or AI or whatever, but like, I have issues with those things, but I don't want to live in a world where like those things get strangled in the crib, like by some authority. I don't want to live in that world either. So, yeah.
It's the endless debate about, open, free markets versus planned societies. Like neither is perfect, but it's like, pick your poison kind of, right?
Yeah.
Or how do you...
Yeah. So I think this kind of allows us to transition sort of something that you brought up early, that I want to talk about a little bit more. And it's, so when I kind of referencing when I first read what this book was supposed to be about, which didn't end up being not true. I don't know how you are, but if there's a book that I know I'm going to read, I don't bother reading any more about it until like I'm done or partway through, right? Like it's similar like movies. If it's a movie I know I'm going to see, I try to not watch the trailer because it's like I want to just let me go in unmolested. So I didn't expect Shadow Ticket to leave Milwaukee for what is it? It's at least the last half of the book, maybe more than that. I kind of thought we were going to be just hanging out in sort of the broader Chicagoland area the whole time. And not to say that I was surprised, but that's not what I was anticipating. And you noted that this is something Pynchon kind of does a lot. It's the American abroad phenomena. And I guess, who are some of his other, Slothrop is an American, right? Who else in the Pynchon, can you think of anybody else in the Pynchon oeuvre that is an American abroad?
Yeah, V has a lot of, Benny Profane and a lot of these guys going to Malta and going around parts of Europe. And then Against the Day has a lot of, Lou Basnight, who shows up again in Shadow Ticket. Yeah. And there's a lot of, I forget all their names, but there are many American characters who end up in like the Balkan Peninsula and a lot of these sort of pre-World War I situations in Against the Day. And Against the Day feels very much like the success or the predecessor to Shadow Ticket. Or Shadow Ticket feels like almost a direct continuation of Against the Day.
Yeah, I think the Lou Basnight character is almost like that's the function he serves, is like Pynchon telling you that or something. Because like plot wise, not that every character has to be like fully integrated into the plot, but there is like an element of the Lou Basnight character in this. You're like, well, what is this guy doing here? and so I think there is a way that like Pynchon's sort of telling you, this is what ties these two together actually, is this guy.
And something else related to that idea of like conglomeration and these unconnected autonomous zones is, there's this whole thing about the unamalgamated ops that that Hicks works for. And this is something I didn't really know that much about the history of the FBI, but I was reading about it. And I guess part of the legacy of J. Edgar Hoover was that he amalgamated all of these different ops, right? He just like took all these kind of local detective agencies and brought them all under the umbrella of the FBI around this time, somewhere in the 20s or 30s. And that, so much, that seems like the nature of so many things in American culture. It's like if something small and local gets big enough, it just gets like sucked up into this kind of larger umbrella that almost always turns it sinister.
Right.
So Hicks, it's interesting, that Pynchon may be like the last of his kind, right? Or, a dying breed. And so is Hicks, right? Like Hicks is kind of also at the end of the line of this world of unamalgamated ops. Like he's about to become amalgamated, or his successor will. And so Lou Basnight, represents an earlier iteration of that, like someone who is even more independent. right? He's sort of the elder statesman of these kinds of like local private eyes. Yeah. And now, I guess there's still private investigators exist, but in terms of like genuine like bureaus of investigation, it's
like the Pinkertons and stuff like that. That's all pretty much gone. That's very interesting, because I laughed at the name Unamalgamated Ops, and I should have known that there was more to it than that. That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, you do have to take delight in the sort of names for organizations and stuff like that Pynchon comes up with, right? There's an organization that Bruno Airmont is sort of behind or at the head of, called Hijack, which is the something about basically like Jews who have left their homeland, like seizing their assets, but it's called Hijack. He's always good at like he's always good at these sort of backronyms and like these goofy names. Even the I mentioned way at the top, the Egon Prediger of the he's supposedly, we find out later that this might not be the case, but he's supposedly involved in the International Criminal Police Association or whatever, but it's the criminal police. So it's, is it police who are trying to catch criminals, or is it police who are criminals? Is the cleverness of that stuff is
or at kind of Krangablatt 49, there's the Peter Penguin Society, which is like the extreme John Birch Society.
right yeah, that stuff is great. I think there's one other question I kind of wanted to get to, and maybe we sort of already kind of covered it. There's you had mentioned something about, and we can, let's talk about this first, and then that. One thing that's in this book and is in a lot of other Pynchon work is the sort of appearance or the presence of sort of paranormal or psychic phenomena. And in this book, chiefly it appears as this aspiratation thing. And of course, Pynchon has fun with it, calling it the ass-ap situation, which is funny in and of itself. But it's this phenomena where, things are basically appearing and disappearing sort of mysteriously, and nobody really seems to understand exactly why this is happening. Hicks has a early experience of it. It kind of sort of spiritually, I guess, saves his life, you might say, because he's a strike breaker, and he's about to, maybe kill this striker. He's got this beaver tail filled with lead balls or something like that, and it kind of disappears out of his hand. And at the time, he didn't attribute any psychic phenomena to it, but he was somewhat mystified by it. And then he learns from Thessaly Wayward, who's a psychic who is also the secretary for the Unamalgamated Ops. But then we get over to Budapest, and ass-ap stuff is like in full swing. It's almost like bureaucratized. There's ass-ap insurance companies that like will insure your stuff from being stolen. There's clearly like heists going on of various kinds using this sort of phenomena. And then there are people like Zoltan van Kiss who like seem to be able to actually like deliberately use it, while also claiming that he doesn't understand how it works by any means. And I guess I'm always fascinated with sort of psychic phenomena. As I mentioned in the Madness episode, I'm going to go deep into the story of this guy who may have proved telepathy back in the 1930s. His studies indicate that he did. And I guess what I wanted to kind of ask you, I mean, I have some thoughts on this. How seriously do you think Pynchon takes that stuff? Or is this a literary device for him? Or somewhere in between? I guess it could be both, right? But
it seems like, not knowing anything about Pynchon himself is hard to know, but he certainly takes it seriously as a device. Like he's continued to use it throughout like 60 years or, so in some sense, whatever he believes about it in the outside world, it has clearly been worth his while to continue to explore it in his fictional world. So I would guess that he does give it some credence. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something interesting about, this idea of local phenomena. Maybe that's why like totalizing conspiracy theories are attractive, but often dubious, is like the desire to want to believe that something explains everything. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? That like there really are aliens and they really are behind, you know, all the machinations of the government and the military, or, you know, whatever it may be. I can see why it's appealing, but it's like reality is probably never that simple. But it might also not be so simple as to say none of this is real.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like both of those are kind of totalizing oversimplifications. And the reality, as far as I can tell, might more likely be in between, when it's like there are genuinely inexplicable events, or there are things that happen that there's no way to say why they happened except through recourse to some kind of a supernatural explanation. Right. And it's so deep in world history, and like every culture has stories about this. It seems like you would have to be more paranoid to believe that everyone was making it up than to believe that it's based on something. You know? Right. And yet it clearly does not explain our daily life. Like most of us are not seeing, you know, Mothman everywhere we go. Right. And yet if you read those books about Mothman, it does seem like those people really saw something. You know what I mean? Yeah. And I think that that's a harder place to be, but it's also more productive because it's just like very sticky and interesting material. It's never settled. Maybe that's a good way to put it. And part of what's interesting about Pynchon is how lively it is, right? And that it's like you go to Budapest and this, you know, lamp really does appear out of nowhere and disappear. But you might go to Vienna and people are like, I've never heard of that, and there's no way that's real. Right. You know, and it seems like, you know, especially in the world of World War II, which this book is so much about, just like the volume of paranormal and mysterious and supernatural stuff associated with like so many aspects of that. I just like don't see how you can dismiss it. Even though I also don't see how you can say, yep, that's what happened. Right? Like it's somewhere in between. But like what that in between means actually is another one of these liminal spaces, right? It's a space kind of between what we call the natural and what we call the supernatural, which might be, you know, it's almost like what we call the natural is the floor and what we call the supernatural is the ceiling. In the same way, your life in a building has to play out between those two spaces. Maybe that's like our life within reality is always playing out. You know, it's like we always have a hunch that certain things are real that we don't actually believe are real. Yeah, or maybe vice versa. If you become one of these people who's like actively talking about, you know, aliens and cryptids, like if you get into that world, those people might have the opposite perspective where they're presenting those things as definitely real, even though inside they're maybe not sure.
Right. No, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think I think there was a review of Pynchon's work before Shadow Ticket where he talks about he basically says, you know, Pynchon points out this paranormal stuff that he's kind of, and Eric Wargo, by the way, is a guy who wrote a book called Time Loops, about which a lot of it is about people who've had like predictive dreams and stuff like this, right? And he's a good writer. He's an interesting guy, not necessarily from the literary side of the house, I guess. But he says that like there's a thing, and I hadn't thought about this, but it seems significant, where as a writer, it's fine. The sort of convention is it's fine to use sort of paranormal psychic stuff, but as soon as it becomes like critical to the plot, like it actually steers the course of events, then that book suddenly becomes like speculative fiction. So it's interesting. I think there's some kind of truth to that, because for Pynchon, this book's got psychic stuff all over the place, and occasionally it kind of becomes salient. I mean, like I said, it does kind of save Hicks's life in a way, but by the end of it, there's a version of this book that doesn't have any appertations in it, that isn't that different, really. And I do kind of think that maybe that does save it from being, though I don't know if I agree with that or not. I think if somebody who wasn't Thomas Pynchon wrote this book, maybe it would just get kind of chucked into the sort of the SF ghetto. I don't know.
And that's a really good point. That maybe is what, you know, the way genre gets sorted is often arbitrary or commercial, but I think there is some truth to that like part of what makes it literary, you know, is obviously just the quality of the writing, but also what you're saying, that it's not like the supernatural elements are directly what take us from one state. It's not like, you know, Hicks apports to Budapest and then it's like he goes in a linear way, and he's drugged on this ship, and there's all this stuff on trains, and maybe it's that is truer to life, in that most of us, I think, live surrounded by the possibility of the supernatural, right? Or we have dreams that we feel like might really be telling us something, or you glimpse something out the window that you're like, that can't be human, or you just get a weird feeling about some place or some person, or a memory occurs to you and you're like, I don't know if that really happened or not. And that's just how we live. But at least in our kind of technological rational era, we try to act as though those things are not significant, right? Like you still try to, most people, if you ask, why did you do this, they won't say, I had a dream that told me to,
right?
Even though that might actually be the reason, right? But they won't say that. And maybe that is what makes a kind of literary book more sophisticated, or more kind of like for adults than most fantasy books, is that it is trying to reckon with that fact. Whereas if you have a book that is just literally like, a fairy told me to do this, and then I became invisible, and then I appeared, and that's interesting for kids, but there's something that feels immature about it, or it feels like it's not actually reckoning with what it's like to be an adult.
I've always thought that, like, and this is almost like for my own personal writing sake, that I've always thought, like, and I have a lot of stuff I've written that's not strictly realistic, but I've always thought I have to make sure, if I'm breaking the so-called laws of reality, that it's not in service of making things simpler than they are, right? It's not so it turns life into a just so story. If you're going to put, for me anyway, that's sort of my personal ethic. If I'm going to put that stuff in there, it actually has to make things more complicated. Because I think that's more fair, because nobody actually knows, like, for instance, I do think there are like prophetic dreams that people have from time to time. I have no idea how or why or how it works or what's in charge of it or what the limitations are. I have no understanding of that. But it actually does make my worldview more complicated. In a way, because now I got to account for that.
and you have to just live with it. Like, you have to develop the ability to live with things. It's almost like you have to develop the ability to eat things that you can't digest.
Right.
It's like you've just swallowed a bunch of plastic and batteries, like stuff that's just in your stomach, and that is real, but you can never integrate it. Yeah, and I think that's right, which is maybe why, if you think of like anime conventions or fantasy Comic-Con, there can be something kind of atavistic about that, because it's like a retreat into a world that makes sense, but is basically not real.
Right.
Which is fine up to a point, but it can cross the point, and then it's not fine. It becomes a problem,
Yeah, then it becomes sort of like, well, it's just like anything. I mean, some people kind of, there is, I think the word escapist gets like, or escapism kind of gets a bad rap, but there is, I think we can all see there is like a line at which, like, if you're escaping too much, then there is something kind of immature about that, right? Like, there is like not facing reality kind of thing. Not that you can't just watch a goofy show on a given evening or whatever, but there is something that's sort of not actually dealing with the world around you to some extent.
Yeah, and it's like, those kinds of things become a religion, right? Or have become a religion in a world that has sort of imperfectly secularized. Yeah. And maybe religion always has this problem, that it's like, for people who have a truly complex and deep relationship with it, it makes the world more complicated. It's like, how is it that we live, in this reality that we feel is not fully real, and yet we also can't tell what's beyond it? If you can live with that feeling, your life will get deeper and deeper. But, religion becomes like an opiate of the masses when it's like just telling people, like, you're good if you do this, and these people are bad if they don't do that, and you just have to, do these few things and you're set forever. And like, it's very appealing to people, but clearly that's not like what is at the heart of religion, right? It's a kind of cheapened version of it that can become dangerous, because it leads to, wars and everything else, right? But at its best, religion, I think, either makes life more complicated, or at least is an attempt to reckon with the complexity of life that is always present, but that we don't have many other ways of actually giving its due. And I think like people always live in bad faith if they know that things are more complicated than they're acting, like they are.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, it's interesting because we're kind of tying this back a little bit because I think there's a sense of this sort of idea about whether it cheapens or deepens that kind of goes to like what Catherine Schultz is asking for. And again, I know the easy version of it's that part that I excerpted, and she's not exactly saying that, but that part of it where she's sort of wanting Pynchon to sort of give us the answer. Like if the whole point of Shadow Ticket was Thomas Pynchon saying Donald Trump bad, punch a Nazi, that would be so cheap. Like, even if you agree with that, it has to feel cheap as like a artistic production. It's like there's so much more. There's so much more to the context of all this that's not enough. I can get that off a bumper sticker, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a work of art, has to be irreducible, or it has to be the shortest version of whatever it's saying.
Yes.
And like I used to go through it. I used to teach animation, and before the students would do their projects, they would all go around and say their concept. And there'd always be a few students who would say their concept like a simple joke, right? It would be like, it's a squirrel who's trying to climb this tree and the branch, they would say it, and I would be like, you just explained that in 30 seconds. Like, why do you want to spend 6 months rendering that? You know what I mean?
It's a good point. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they would inevitably not make good projects if they tried to do that. Whereas you would have other students who would often have a much vaguer pitch, or they would be like, it's some world where I think this is happening and I want to use this kind of color. And, and I was like, do that. That's good, because it's going to take you 6 months to figure out what you're doing.
Right.
And that means that time will be well spent.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think like if it's fine if a book has a theme, but it's like if the whole point of the book can be reduced to a bumper sticker, it should just be a bumper sticker.
Right. Yeah. I definitely believe that. Well, let's kind of wind down here. What are, this has been a fascinating conversation for me. I think people are going to enjoy it. Is there some characters or settings that we kind of haven't touched on that you enjoyed for one reason or another, you found particularly funny or interesting or captivating? There's so many there's so many people and places in this book. It's incredible. For 274 pages or whatever, it's pretty much like every 3 pages is a whole new world opens up. But is there any that kind of come to mind that we didn't miss that you enjoyed?
I mean, I love a lot of those underground spaces that we were talking about. I love a lot of the travel scenes. Like there's a great train journey when he's going from, maybe he starts in Milwaukee and is heading to New York, and like he passes Pittsburgh and Altoona, and there's this very just kind of spooky, nighttime sort of Depression era image of internal Pennsylvania. There's some really cool vampire stuff. The whole book starts with this Bela Lugosi quote, and there's a scene where Hicks and his girlfriend in Milwaukee go to see Dracula and talk about Bela Lugosi, and then they end up and then in the Hungarian part they end up in Transylvania, and there is this kind of like heading to the center of the myth realm thing. Right. I mean, I just love those types of liminal spaces and the sort of way that like Hicks as a somewhat normal character ends up within it. And there's something else that I was thinking about in terms of these types of DMZs or liminal spaces is the idea of interzone, in William S. Burroughs, who is a kind of contemporary of Pynchon, right? Maybe a tiny bit older, but more or less a contemporary, and writing about a lot of the same stuff of this sort of like creepy underside of American mass culture, and again, Americans abroad. But I guess with Pynchon, it's more accessible because Pynchon his characters are always like basically normal people. Right. And therefore you have this, they're sort of caricatures, but you could kind of relate to them. And you have this feeling that they're entering this spooky, mysterious world. And same feeling you get with Murakami is like the sense of what would it be like if I was there? Whereas with Burroughs, I feel like you always kind of admire it from a distance because it's like Burroughs himself seems so weird and so unlike most people. Right. And the world itself is just kind of like filthy and perverted and bizarre from the beginning. Which is interesting, but it's like you can't really step into it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Whereas with Pynchon, I think he really does, same as Lynch or Dylan, they're these kinds of like popular surrealists, right? Or populist surrealists, that there's something actually quite normal about them, which is what makes them so strange. it's like, what is the difference between David Lynch and, Maya Deren or something? It's like some sense that his worlds are basically accessible. You can relate to it as a kind of melodrama or as a horror movie or as a mystery.
Right.
But then it goes to something.
Yeah, once you're in, then he's going to do other things to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, but he gets, or same thing with Dylan. It's like, okay, this is a kind of folk song, but now he's talking about some totally, alternate plane of existence that no other folk song would talk about.
Right.
And so I think, Pynchon is speaking of, again, of, selling the shadow ticket, or like, what kind of a ticket are you buying? He's really great at just bringing you into these worlds that are like just familiar enough to understand how unfamiliar they are, right? It's not like you've instantly been dropped into this just like tank full of monsters. Like, it doesn't have that feeling the way Burroughs does.
Right.
I don't know.
Burroughs,
and it's
Burroughs stuff too. You feel like there is something like, I don't know exactly how to say this. Pynchon is telling you, it's like Pynchon is telling you about the thing, and most writers are telling you about, they're telling you about the thing or showing you the thing. Whereas sometimes reading Burroughs feels like it is the thing somehow. Like I'm going to end up on heroin by the time I'm out of this book.
Burroughs seems like he is a character from his own world.
Right.
Or just that he is genuinely describing his own life and his own mental landscape.
Yeah.
Whereas Pynchon, we obviously don't know much about him, but doesn't seem that way. He seems like he's probably a pretty normal guy.
Probably, yeah.
Or just a kind of nerdy.
I bet he's fun. I bet he's
intelligent New York kind of dude. Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, I bet if you were at dinner with Thomas Pynchon, you would remember that for a while. I bet that's
totally
a good time.
Do you know the writer Stephen Wright?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. He taught at the New School when I was there. So he did these like weekend seminars on different books, but he did one on Gravity's Rainbow. So he would come in like every Saturday for a few weeks, and he would just kind of like go all in on Gravity's Rainbow. And I guess he knows Pynchon, right? It has some connection to it. And he said, I forget if it was Pynchon's sister, or it was some woman who knew Pynchon really well. And she went out on a date with some guy. And that guy was asking her about Pynchon. And they were at some fancy restaurant on a Friday night. And the guy asked her, he said, knowing Pynchon as well as you do, where do you think he is right now? And she said, I can tell you exactly where he is. He's at home in his pajamas watching the Brady Bunch.
That's awesome. That seems right. That seems totally right to me. Right. Yeah. Right. Well, that's like when he showed up on The Simpsons. When I saw it as a kid, I was like, I didn't even know who it was, honestly. And then like a little bit later, when I kind of learned, he's this. But before I'd read any, he's like this well-respected writer who's kind of reclusive. And I was like, then why was he on The Simpsons? That seems weird. And then now, like, it totally makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Like, it's an
and he said that
choice.
Homer is his hero. In a way, he said that a few times. Yeah. I know someone else who grew up on Long Island, I guess in sort of a fancy milieu.
Yeah.
And he said when he was a kid, he went to a funeral, for some person that his family knew. Mm-hmm. And he said, it was filled with all these old guys. And then years later, his mom told him that Pynchon was one of the guys there, but he has no idea which one it was. It was just one of the guys who was at this funeral.
That's pretty awesome. That's pretty cool. He could be anywhere.
Exactly.
He could go out. You could,
Totally.
You could go out to eat today. If there's an old man in the corner, that could be him.
Totally. Yeah, it's not like Salinger in that he's genuinely never seen, right? He's just in New York, I think, but it's kind of amazing that it's amazing how little about him seems to get out.
Yeah, I think it's cool that like everybody he knows seems to have like signed on to not spill the beans or send a photo of him or to somebody or whatever. It's difficult. Yeah. There's very
it almost
few people.
Is speaking of this idea of like local magic or localized magic, that's almost an example of it, of like how do you exist in this like hyper surveilled endlessly like gossip ridden era and not have like leaks happening every day. It does feel like he's within his own kind of protective force field.
Right. That's pretty cool. But even still, Thomas, if you're out there and you want to come on the show, open invite, no video, we'll just chat.
You can just talk about The Simpsons the whole time.
Yeah, we literally that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Well, let's close it there. This was so much fun. I really do appreciate it. I'm going to have links to David's social media in the show notes, Twitter, Substack, website, etc. Go out, do yourself a favor, go out, buy the Squimbop Condition right now, or any one of David's other books. But Squimbop Condition is hot. It's out there right now. It's really good. Like I said, I just finished it. I enjoyed the heck out of it. David and I are going to be talking very soon. I got some questions because I feel like I just went on a psychedelic trip having read the Squimbop Condition, and I'm piecing myself back together. So hopefully David can help me with that process. Yeah. Other than that, anything else you wanna mention or promote, I guess?
No, that's great.
No?
Yeah, this book is
Okay.
just came out. We'll talk about it more next week. So
Yeah.
we can get back into it. But
Sure.
yeah, that's the newest thing, and something else is coming out next year, but we can talk about that later on.
Yeah,
also.
I want to talk about it because you are a productive dude, and I'm gonna try to see if I can get to the source of your secrets. But that's for our next conversation.
Yeah, I'll spill them all next
Okay,
time.
excellent, excellent. All right, take care, everybody.
Well, thanks for having me. This is great.
Of course, yeah, thank you.
Have you ever heard about Willie the Weeper? Had a job as a chimney sweeper. He had the dope habit and he had it bad. Listen while I tell you about a dream he had. He went down to the dope shop one Saturday night. He knew the lights would all be burning bright. Well, I guess he smoked a dozen pills or more. When he woke up, he was on a foreign shore. The Queen of Sheba was the first he met. She called him lovey-dovey and honey pet. She gave him a great big automobile with a diamond headlight and a golden wheel. Down in Honolulu, Willie fell in a trance, seeing the dusky beauties do the hula dance. His sweetie got in jail and Willie sure did shout when he got the news that she had wiggled out. He landed with a splash in the river Nile, riding on a sea-going crocodile. He winked at Cleopatra, she said, ain't he a sight? He said, how about a date for next Saturday night? He had 1,000,000 cattle and he had 1,000,000 sheep, had 1,000,000 vessels on the ocean deep, had $1,000,000 all in nickels and dimes. Well, he knew because he counted it 1,000 times. He landed in New York one evening late. He asked his sugar for an after date. Started to kiss her and she started to pout when bang, bang, and the dope gave